Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going over a big mystery box of essentially what are termed Spencer disc among the Laserdisc Forever group, and this, of course, means primarily classic titles. Now, this is a mystery box from the wonderful Maxeene, the Laserdisc queen, over at HollywoodLaserdisc.com, which is pretty much the internet's best one-stop shopping for Laserdiscs outside of the Laserdisc database. So if you've never been over to Hollywood Laserdisc, definitely go and pay it a visit. And of course, at Hollywood Laserdisc, you never have to pay late fees. But Maxeene does a really great job of not only catering to Laserdisc fans, but having a phenomenal stock and inventory of just thousands of Laserdiscs that she's scoured everywhere, all over pretty much California and other states as well for. And so if it's not in stock on the website, you can always shoot her a message, and she's probably got a copy of most everything you're looking for. And she'll also do big sales on the Laserdisc Forever group page as well. But when she messaged me and said that she had a whole bunch of they're either termed Spencer discs or old man discs or just OMDs for short. It's sort of a running joke with members of the Laserdisc Wolfpack podcast. But she sent me a gigantic box of titles, some of which were some doubles. So I've sorted those out, and we'll be using those as discs to send to people and different things. So I've done a brief sorting of this, and to just go over all of these titles, since there's so many, I just have to jump into it. To go through by some of the notable directors first. So to start the director's shelf, I've got the earlier pressing of the Robert Aldrich directed Kiss Me Deadly, the late noir masterpiece based on Mickey Spillane. It is still the best Mike Hammer film adaptation, and this is the earlier video version, so it doesn't have the discovery of the much darker and better fitting ending, but it's also in the 1:3:3 ratio, so it's not matted widescreen. And it's also got a PCM mono track, which I'm very curious to compare with the later versions that all stem from that late Laserdisc, early DVD MGM did, where they reinstated the darker and better ending. So I've always been curious about this. It's otherwise, again, the earlier 1:3:3 transfer with digital mono, so it just doesn't have the darker ending. Do keep that in mind. But I'm just super curious to look at the transfer and also compare the audio. So this is a disc I've always meant to check out. The rear is quite nice. The images are striking, of course, because it's Kiss Me Deadly, but it's a really great MGM rear cover for the time. The film is just a single CLV disc with PCM mono, and it does include the trailer at the end. So this was supplanted by the much harder to find later release disc that I did find, and oddly I was able to get that long before this one, so this is just another pressing I've been meaning to check out for ages. This is an earlier MGM disc. I don't often go for these because they don't have digital audio, but if I get the chance to look at one, you never know what the analog audio is going to be like, and sometimes the transfers are really good. But this is the Busby Berkeley picture Babes in Arms from 1939, of course with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland in the sort of stylized MGM jacket at this time, where they would put the film stars inside the MGM lion logo, which is quite cute. So there is something to be said about the sort of cute factor of these covers, and they are quite nice. This is one of the nicest conditioned jackets of this style I've seen in a long time. Usually they're really, since they're older discs, they're usually pretty beat up, but this is basically what replaced the sort of rainbow label MGM disc. And also it's great to avoid the rainbow labels because they can usually be prone to laser rot for a lot of those pressings. So I'm just really curious to check this out. I'm very curious to see what the transfer's like and to look at the audio and maybe compare that to the film's release on DVD. But I'm just a big Berkeley fan, so anytime I get to look at one of the other transfers of one of his films, I'm just happy to do so. First, I have the 1962 picture A Child Is Waiting, directed by John Cassavetes, so this is early for him as a director. This is from MGM UA with the usual style of artwork. Still in the shrink wrap, looks fantastic. This has been on my watch list for a very long time, so I'm finally going to get to see this. But of course, it's a 1962 film, and there's no mention of a widescreen transfer, so I'm thinking this is open matted. But it does have digital PCM sound sound, which should be the original mono mix. It's otherwise the nice style of MGM jacket, and we do have a single CLV disc with PCM mono and the original trailer at the end. And a rather nice jacket too at that, because this is when MGM UA was really starting to step up their game and start to make some spiffier jackets. Next, for George Cukor, this is an earlier pressing of the classic Born Yesterday. So we have really nice artwork. Obviously, this is the VHS sleeve art expanded with the red banner that you get on all of these RCA Columbia discs, with the earlier laser video disc banner. So it's obviously an earlier pressing. It's going to have analog audio only, and you've got the black banner on the top of the rear. But this cover's in really nice shape, which is surprising because most of the Columbia jackets from the early to mid 80s like this are usually pretty shot by now. And this does have the original gloss on here, which you'll find on some of these. So this is actually a nice jacket. Of course, the transfer, it remains to be seen if it's going to be any good, because most early LDs, especially for classic films, you never know how the picture transfer or how the analog audio is going to hold up, or how well it was done, or what the source was like. But for the most part, what I've seen of a lot of the Columbia discs with jackets like this, they can be pretty solid. So sometimes they're quite surprising. So it'll be interesting to spin this up and check out the transfer. We have the CLV edition of the remastered presentation of Casablanca with the iconic painting for the reissue by Dudash, which is one of the great film posters, I think, and one of the truly great reissue posters. Now, this artwork is only on the CLV. It's not on the big CAV 50th anniversary box that I have. So this is just a particular jacket that I've always admired because I love this poster artwork, and it is sort of the version of the film's poster art that I did grow up with. And so it's just really nice to have on a jacket. This is otherwise just a CLV pressing of the transfer that's in the CAV box. The rear is also quite nice. So while I do think the actual artwork of the CAV box is nice and striking, it's also very much of its time. And you would think that the really spiffy imagery, along with the really amazing 50th anniversary poster artwork, would be on the CAV box as well, but they tried to do something different. So if you're a big Casablanca fan, and especially if you love this artwork, you will want to get the CLV version. This is just a title that I've always meant to pick up just for the jacket if I found a cheap copy, and this one's in really nice shape. Again, otherwise, it's just a single disc CLV version of the master on the CAV release. Same transfer, same PCM mono track, but of course you do lose out on the additional extras that are in the box set, such as the vintage documentary that was made for that set. Here you only get the 2 trailers. That, of course, was for Michael Curtiz. Next, for Cecil B. DeMille, I've got the encore edition of the classic Cleopatra with really nice artwork in the traditional encore style. So it looks plain at first, but it's actually quite spiffy looking. And there is at least a light gloss finish on the jacket, which is nice and has held up pretty well. This copy has a little bit of wear, but it's not a very common disc. So it's in the usual encore style, which of course means the iconic universal no chapter stops until the end of side 2. Chapter 1 is the trailer at the end. So at least we get the trailer, but if you were looking for chapters, you're pretty much out of luck. And if you accidentally hit the chapter button, it would skip to the end of the film to play you the trailer. So it's always an amusing part of Encore Disc, because this is before studios thought trailers were important, but at least they did put the trailer on here and were nice enough to give it a chapter stop. Now, Universal has done a big restoration of this and has released a really lovely Blu-ray, which I have, but I'm just very curious to see what the old Encore transfer looks like. And of course, this has analog audio only, as do most Encore discs. Now, for the sort of flip side of the towards the end of DeMille's career, I have the spiffed up Paramount reissue of The Buccaneer, which was given a brand new transfer. This, of course, is a VistaVision film, so this is Paramount going back to the at least the original negative materials that survived and trying to do a new transfer also with a brand new stereo mix. So this is quite a spiffy release, nice looking jacket, but it's also got a quite substantial gatefold, which is far spiffier than what you usually saw on Paramount releases. So here you have the chapter stops. This also includes trailers for other DeMille films, Samson and Delilah and The Greatest Show on Earth. Really lovely images on this, I have to admit. Really nice color printing as well. And we do have a note about the technical transfer. So this was made from a new inner negative that was made from the VistaVision Separation Masters, and the audio was a new stereo mix where they took the original mono and mixed it with the stereo music stems to create a new stereo track. But nicely, they do have the original mono here on the analog track. And then also, if you look down here in the bottom corner, we also have an isolated music track. So this is one of those where it's multi-audio with the stereo remix on the digital tracks. Then analog 1 is the mono mix, and analog 2 is the isolated music and effects track, which is really nice. The rear is also nice looking, very much what you'd see on a Paramount disc of this time. Nice imagery, nice color. This is just a title that you don't see all that often, and it's one I had been meaning to pick up because it's a spiffier release with a bunch of audio options as well. Next, for John Ford, I've got the early Paramount disc of Donovan's Reef, and you can tell it's early Paramount, very plain cover with the older Paramount logos and their typical laser video disc banner in the corner. Still, it's in really nice shape for it being an older LD. The rear is exactly what you find on other Paramount discs of this time. Some nice images, a little bit of color shifting because they were scanning what seemed like old floppy cards and stills, but otherwise this is just a solid but older analog audio only disc. So I'll be checking the transfer on this and then looking at the analog mono to compare it to some of the later releases on DVD and such. And of course, being an early Laserdisc, this of course is going to be 1:3:3. It's not going to be widescreen, so it's obviously not in the original ratio either. Next, for John Huston, this one should be really interesting because this is the Bible on the older Fox original widescreen edition with their traditional sort of gray banner with the sort of letterboxing on the cover. Interesting image choice. It obviously lets you know this is the Bible, but not necessarily the most epic photo. Some of the photos that Fox would choose for the covers at this time could be a little random or almost generic looking, but you kind of get used to it, and there's a certain charm to the Fox designs at this time. The rear is also the traditional Fox design. With your chapter stops, there are, of course, no extras, and this does have a PCM digital stereo mix, which should be matrixed, I would think. It's not indicated on here, but this was a big production by Dino De Laurentiis, shot in the Dimension 150 process. Of course, it's large format, and so obviously an old letterbox Laserdisc transfer is probably not the best way to see it, but these are also always fascinating to see how they transferred films at the time. And most often, the soundtracks are transferred without being messed with, so sometimes they can be a great source for audio or for a different mix of the film. And this being so early, I assume this is probably transferred from a 35mm reduction copy, as it took quite a while for studios to be able to transfer 70mm films in large format outside of using 35mm reductions. But it's just always fascinating to see early transfers of big, large format films, and this is a film that still needs a modern, a brand new scan, really, because the Blu-ray itself that it has is not particularly very good. We also have a really well done gatefold for the time in the usual Fox style. This has held up really well because you have it's not a gloss finish, but a lot of these Fox widescreen discs do have a type of matte finish on them, which holds up pretty well if they're stored well. And then we have some nice text and write-up with the cast list as well. And interestingly, somebody paid $69.99 for this back in the day because the shrink wrap is in here. Next, there's some for Ernst Lubitsch, and this one is definitely the big surprise of this box because, you know, with it being older classic releases, you figure that they're pretty much going to be late 80s to early 90s or so, because that's where most of them were made or manufactured. But I was flipping through to just organize this for the video, and then I saw this sticking out, and I'm like, wait, is that what I think it is? This is actually a 1998 late release pressing, a very uncommon disc, and I'm super excited to finally be able to check this transfer out because it's Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be from 1942, the classic with Jack Benny and Carole Lombard. Now, I'm very curious to check this out because this has a PCM mono soundtrack, and I want to compare it to the DVD from Warner and the Criterion Blu-ray. Now, the Criterion Blu-ray is obviously the best in video, and the Warner DVD was definitely a bit bright, but I'm really curious to check out the audio. This is obviously a late release Warner disc, really spiffy covered, lovely imagery, very thick gloss on it, but very thin cardstock. So this one is in really nice shape because most of these every time you find them, they've got blown out spines, they've got crumpled corners, they've got ring wear and everything, because these were just not made to be, floating around in a box or kicking around on a shelf, because these were done so late that obviously, as you see here, they were done by Image Entertainment. So anytime it's a later disc, not just from Warner, but from most studios, it's going to be an Image disc. So that's how you always know. And of course, there's the 1998 information. So this, of course, is CLV, single disc, film only, and no extras. The real draw here is looking at the transfer, having a lovely, very uncommon late release. But for me, the even bigger draw is being able to look at the PCM mono soundtrack and compare it to the Warner DVD and Criterion Blu-ray. Next, we have Lubitsch's Heaven Can Wait, which is here in the Fox edition. This is still in the shrink wrap. Nice image choice, and kind of done like one of their widescreen jackets, which isn't common for one of their older classics. They didn't always do this, but it's kind of interesting. This is just a single disc, but the actual jacket is kind of done like it's going to be a widescreen disc because it's got the black bars of sorts. But otherwise, it's a standard CLV disc. No extras, you would think, but if you look here, it says, please note in the analog audio mode, because there's actually two different tracks. So this actually has an isolated music and effects track on one of the analog channels. So this has PCM mono, which I'm really curious to check out and compare to the Criterion Blu-ray release, and also look at the transfer, because transfers for Technicolor films of this era on LD can be really fascinating. Sometimes they can be amazingly spot on and close to a modern restoration, and other times they can be completely terrible. It just depends on what elements they had and how well the transfer was done. But the audio is always, you never know if it's going to be better or worse or the same as a later or current version. But this has a isolated music and effects track, which I wasn't even aware of. I just knew I had this on my wish list. So that this is one of the few Fox discs that actually has one of these and actually has it marked. And it seems like it was pretty early for them because they worded it kind of like a warning to make sure that people weren't going to complain, I guess, because if you didn't have digital sound capability, it would be playing both analog tracks unless you selected one on your player, and then people would probably start writing complaint letters. Next, for Joseph Mankiewicz, this is the early Columbia RCA disc for Suddenly Last Summer. So it's in the sort of same style you'll see on all of these RCA Columbia discs with the red banner, very thin cover, and of course this is a 133 transfer with analog audio only. So not the best video version in terms of technical quality, but these are still fascinating to look at. And of course this gives me a chance to look at the analog audio on here, because pretty much for every film, you have to check every audio source you can just to see what's on the disc or tape and then compare it to everything else. So with some of these that I'm just looking at for transfer, it'll at least let me be able to look at the audio. And again, sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised. You might stumble across a disc with a really good transfer, but obviously you'll want to get the indicator Blu-ray of this, for example, with its nice supplements if you just have an older release like this. But otherwise, it's in the standard RCA style, has the black banner on the top, on the back. And this one, as you can see, has some definite wear on it because these are pretty thin jackets. So usually when you see an older Columbia release, the jackets have some definite wear to them. Also for Leo McCarey, his remake of An Affair to Remember. And this, of course, is the spiffed up, slightly later Fox widescreen version. There's actually a couple different printings of this. This is later because, of course, it has the updated Fox Video logo. Older releases will just have the CBS Fox on there. And then weirdly, there's some copies floating around of this that has a different cover image. Otherwise, it seems to be the same. So again, there's a couple variations out there, but if you want the technically spiffiest one, you'll want to find this one, but make sure it's got the updated Fox logo. So it's the later pressing. And like some of these, the little widescreen banner logo is shrunk on the top, so it's not big like they used to be. And for some reason, Fox did this sometimes and made the image bigger like this. And why they did this, I don't know. I've just seen too many of these jackets and happened to notice that some of them have the little tiny squashed widescreen logo. The rear is still the same gray background style with some nice notes. The chapter stops. The film is on a single CLV disc with a widescreen transfer, no supplements, but it does have a stereo surround matrix encoded PCM track, which should be based on the original 4-channel mix for this being a Fox Cinemascope film. It would have originally had 4-track magnetic stereo in the premiere engagements, and Fox, even at this time, kept trying to preserve those where possible, so that seems to be what's on here. There is, of course, a lovely gatefold with a full-page panel, very beautifully printed color photo of Grant and Deborah Carr there. And Fox really did a great job, even at this time, doing the gatefolds, which were usually head and shoulders above a lot of the other studios. Next, for Lewis Milestone, this picture is... It does have its fans. It is definitely an oddball, and it's one of the giant film runaway productions that a lot of people will groan and complain about, but it's also quite fascinating. And also, what's ironic is this box contains the 2 major film versions of this story on LD. So this is the 1962 remake of Mutiny on the Bounty, famously a Brando vehicle who very much imposes on will on the film. This is the first letterbox release, and for it being the standard MGM UA style art, I think this does look quite impressive. Of course, Warner did finally do a newer scan for their Blu-ray release, but that's kind of getting out of date, and this was shot in Ultra Panavision 70, so it's a big, large format roadshow film. Regardless of what you may think of it, it is definitely a film that needs a modern high-resolution scan and UHD release. But again, it's fascinating to look at Laserdisc presentations where they got their sort of first crack at doing a widescreen version. The rear also has a spiffier rear cover in terms of the imagery. It's still in the MGM UA home video style, but this is the point where they were, again, starting to improve their jackets a little bit more and get away from the designs that kind of very much felt like what they were doing throughout the late 80s. This does have a digital soundtrack. It is matrix stereo encoded, which is apparently a version of the original multi-channel mix, and it's nice to see that on a Laserdisc release at this time, so you were at least getting a version of the original multi-channel mix experience. Interestingly, there's no listing of the chapter stops, but we do get a note that this does include the trailer. The gatefold, however, is really well done, but it is entirely images. And like most MGM discs around this time, it's a photo collage with most of them being tinted black and white or tinted color stills. But usually they would have the chapter stops in here, so either I guess somebody got carried away with the photos and forgot the chapter stops, or they just didn't feel like putting all the chapter stops for a film that's over 3 hours. And this is the full-length version that clocks in at over 3 hours, so I'm believing this has the intermission in there as well. It just doesn't have the chapter stops, but this is the first attempt at presenting a full version of the film in something approaching its intended ratio and sound format. Then for Preston Sturges, I've got the Encore disc of The Great McGinty, again in the traditional Encore style. The artwork is very much sized for VHS, and then the rest is kind of dead space with a random color. The rear is oriented a little bit differently because the images are on the side, and again, this is very much just looks like an expanded version of the VHS sleeve, which it pretty much is. We do, of course, as usual for Universal, get no chapters except chapter 1 for the trailer at the end of side 2. This, of course, like all the other Encores of this time, analog sound only. It's going to be an older print transfer, but these can sometimes be really surprising and have a fantastic transfer. They can also have a really crummy transfer. It just, it's a total roll of the dice. You never know what you're going to get with one of these, but it is fascinating to look at the old Encore editions, especially for favorite films, and this will give me a chance to compare the audio on here to the audio of the Kino Blu-ray. Then I've also got the Fox release of Unfaithfully Yours from 1948, which is pretty much at the end of Sturges' directing career, unfortunately. He was such a bright flame, but for such a short time, and it's really, I think, quite ridiculous that the studios just basically just insisted he was pretty much burnt out, and so all Sturges films are worth their weight in gold, even the ones like this that don't have as great a reputation. But this is like most Fox releases, a nice sort of random image choice, nicely presented on here, and then we have the blue CBS Fox banner on the bottom. So this looks like most CBS Fox releases of Fox Studio Classics. The rear has the standard design, some nice images, nice write-up, but the real draw here is that it has a PCM mono soundtrack. And most of the Fox discs that I've looked at like this from this era do have really good soundtracks. And sometimes, like the disc for Laura, it's actually the best sound that exists for the film on home video. So anytime I get to look at another Fox classic on LD with a PCM mono track, I get really excited because a lot of times they can be really important for trying to preserve the film's audio. For Raoul Walsh, I've got the Cagney vehicle, A Lion is in the Streets from 1953. This is a standard Warner release, but it's not super common, and the front artwork, while it's obviously working from what was designed for a VHS, it's actually quite more dynamic than usual and doesn't have the big Warner silver bar or anything. It's also got a nice gloss finish on here. But you flip over to the back and you've got your usual Warner design with the silver bar and everything. But I was just really excited to be able to look at this. Now, it doesn't credit that this has a digital audio track. I believe it does. I'm not 100% sure, so I always have to double check LDDB. But anyway, the Warner jackets are notorious for never indicating if it's widescreen or not, if it has digital sound or not. But this, of course, will be a mono track, and I'm really curious to compare this to the recent Warner Archive Blu-ray release. So it's kind of fortuitous that this is here in this box, so I can compare it to the Warner Archive disc. And then to close out the sort of director's section, I've got the 1993 film of It's All True, which is basically working out of the unfinished It's All True film, the legendary project that Orson Welles undertook and basically devolved into multiple segments that never got finished, and it was not really his fault, but he kind of got blamed for it, and it's what led to essentially the end of his career at RKO after Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons. This, of course, was the project he was working on in South America at the request of the federal government to sort of bolster U.S. and South American relations during the war. But, of course, because he was in South America making this film, he wasn't around for the editing of The Magnificent Ambersons, and that further compounded the issue of that film being butchered for all time. But in 1993, an effort was put together to produce this documentary that uses some of the surviving materials and tries to tell the story of the film and at least give a presentation of what exists and what the original concept was and what the story behind it was. This did get a Laserdisc release that I have here and then a DVD port as well. So this is quite a nice and spiffy release. This does have PCM audio, which of course means it's better than the glossy DVD audio. So since this has never gotten a modern transfer or a deluxe special edition with, say, more of the It's All True footage or more extras and supplements and things, this is still really important, and it's really nicely done. It's very much like their release of the Hearts of Darkness, Eleanor Coppola Apocalypse Now documentary. So if you like watching documentaries about films on LD, this is an absolute must, and if you're an Orson Welles fanatic like me, this is an absolute must. Now, to go through the rest of these in chronological order, starting with this one, this is 1934's One Night of Love, which is in the Columbia Classics banner. It's got a little bit of wear on the jacket, which you'll see on a lot of these because it's a black background, but this is the point where Columbia discs were getting a bit spiffed up. It's still got the RCA logo on the bottom, but they did start adding digital soundtracks to these, and I really love the overall banner with the gold and the Columbia torch lady and everything, so there is something to be said about how nice these look. The rear is pretty straightforward, but again, the real draw here is that at this point, Sony was actually doing digital sound on their classic LDs. So for most Columbia films, you're usually going to find their best Laserdisc presentation in this series, which did go through basically two different eras. This was the first, and then they made a spiffed up one that you see on some of the Frank Capra films. And then some films got reissued with both cover designs. So it's just nice that they were making an effort at having a uniform cover art design. Then we have 1935's classic version of Mutiny on the Bounty, with, of course, Charles Laughton and Clark Gable. This is a MGM UA disc from 1993 with a beautiful rendition of the original poster artwork. They didn't do this very often, and I'm quite surprised they did this so infrequently because this looks fantastic. It almost looks more like a late release LD, but it's definitely the best version on Laserdisc, and it does add a PCM mono soundtrack. The rear cover is also a bit spiffier, and of course, 1993, so spiffier jacket, obviously. But it's also got a really substantial gatefold with a nice finish, thicker cardstock, lovely amount of chapter stops, and we do actually get 2 vintage short subjects at the end of the film. So this is one of the MGM releases where they started putting on short subjects in cartoons, which is important to get those preserved as well. But we have nice imagery and also a nice bit of text write-up as well. So this is one of the definitely spiffiest, what is seemingly a standard classic release, but obviously it's actually a bit spiffed up, newer transfer with PCM mono audio finally, and now I get to finally compare the audio of this to later versions. Next from 1936 is Born to Dance, also from MGM UA, and this is getting me one step closer to having all of Jimmy Stewart's filmography, but this is him paired with Eleanor Powell, and a really nice jacket actually, still nicely in the original shrink wrap, and this does have the all-important digital audio, so it'll be nice to compare this to eventually. I think this did get a Warner Archive DVD release, if I'm remembering correctly, so I'd like to pick that up at some point and compare the audio, although I'm sure it's probably the same transfer. The rear is in the style of MGM UA at the time, but it's nicely laid out. So I think it's a bit better designed in the layout than some of theirs, which had a lot of dead space. So it's a really nice looking disc in terms of the jacket, and of course does also include the original trailer at the end, which MGM was always really good about including where they could, but this is a nicer later release because it does give you the digital mono. Next is the classic Noir, This Gun for Hire, which of course is iconic for pairing Alan Ladd with Veronica Lake. This has a really nice cover, nicely stylized, nice color, but it's actually surprisingly an MCA Universal licensed disc that was done by Image. So it's sort of a cross between a studio release and an Image release. It doesn't pop up super often, but the cover is also really nicely done. But it's fascinating to see a Laserdisc that's part studio, part Image Entertainment, so it kind of straddles the fence. This unfortunately doesn't have digital audio, so it's analog mono only, but I'm curious to look at the transfer. I'm sure it's probably going to definitely be from a Warren source, because most of the older video releases of the Alan Ladd films especially are usually pretty worn looking, but it'll be just really fascinating to see this Noir classic, which was also shot by John Seitz, one of the great Noir cameramen, and see what it looks like on the LD pressing. Next is the classic Rita Hayworth vehicle, CoverGirl, in the super looking Columbia Classics spiffed up banner, but one of the few discs where they had the lighter background, I guess, to fit this being a much more colorful film and the colorful shot of Rita Hayworth on the cover. The rear is also quite nice, and they do highlight in red, rather interestingly, the musical numbers to make those stand out, so those have their own chapter stops. It's otherwise just a single CLV disc with PCM mono, so at least you get digital sound, and some nice, as usual, Sony liner notes. Next, we have The Razor's Edge, which is the Fox adaptation of the Somerset Maugham classic story. Lovely shot of Tyrone Power and Gene Tierney here on the front cover. It looks a little plain at first, but again, the more you see of these Fox jackets, it's actually got a particular style, which is quite nice. And then we have the Fox banner on the bottom, but this again is a later pressing because it's got the Fox Video logo as opposed to CBS Fox. And if you'll notice, it's actually black, as the earlier CBS Fox ones would have a blue banner. So I think they quickly realized the black on the bottom doesn't clash like the blue does with a black and white image. The rear nicely has this sort of mint green color to go with the title font on the front, and it looks quite nice to go with the black and white images. We have the usual Fox layout, but it's of course not a widescreen disc. This does have the nice bit of liner notes, a little bit of production information, and then the chapter stops. The film is spread over 3 sides. It's of course Academy ratio, but it does have a newsreel at the end. So this was another example of studio tacking on a vintage piece of material as a supplement, which at this point, especially on a Fox disc, is very uncommon. This does have mono PCM audio, though, so that's the real draw for me, to be able to compare the PCM track on here to later DVD releases. Next is the MGM UA pressing for 1993 of The Great Caruso. So this is a biopic about the famous opera singer, and the artwork is actually quite nice. It's obviously designed to be sized down for VHS as well, but it looks nice on an LD jacket, and this is not a very common title. Of course, as the front tells you, this does have the all-important, for me at least, digital sound, and this does have a nice rear with good imagery, good chapter breakdown, and it does include the original trailer as well. So this is just a nice solid MGM UA release of a title you don't often see, so I'm happy to always look at any MGM UA Laserdisc release, especially if it's got digital sound. Next is the Paramount release of The Naked Jungle, which has a super dramatic and striking, very science fiction pulpy cover to represent the giant plague of ants that threaten our lead characters. So this is definitely one of the most atypical jackets from the time. This is a Paramount release because, of course, you've got their laser video disc banner in the upper corner. So, of course, this is going to be an earlier disc, a 133 transfer with analog audio only. But you can see how this sets the tone for Paramount's designs on LD, and they would just basically modify their style over the years, but it remains similar to these earlier pressings. So I'm just curious to look at this to check out the transfer. I haven't seen this film in a good number of years, and it was actually produced by George Powell. So of course you can then figure why it has the focus on the impending ants and why the cover likes to focus on that. So it definitely fits it being a George Powell produced film. But it'll be really interesting to check out the transfer on this and see how the picture and audio holds up. Next, from 1955, is a really nice MGM letterbox pressing of Diane, which is a period costume drama. It's apparently the last Lana Turner film that she made for MGM on her original contract. But of course, for me, the real draw is this is an early film for Roger Moore in his early studio contract days when he was at MGM. This is a really nice LD. It's still in the original shrink wrap in perfect shape. And then the rear is also quite spiffy and has a feel of it being, of course, a period film. This is a letterbox transfer, and it does have a single CLV disc. We do have the original trailer at the end, and then we've also got a digital soundtrack, which I'm not sure. It could have original multi-track stereo mixes that were done, and then obviously that would be matrixed here on the LD, or it could be mono. I'll just have to pop this in and play it, because I've seen MGM discs have an unadvertised multi-channel matrix stereo track, and then I've also seen them with mono tracks. It just depends, but sometimes you never know. But this is just a film I've always been meaning to see, and now I can look at it on this really nice LD in really great shape. Here's another MGM Lana Turner vehicle that's a big historical period piece. This is The Prodigal, also with a really striking cover, brand new letterbox transfer with digital sound, so this very much goes with the previous disc. This one, though, has the more traditional style of MGM rear, but of course it's much spiffier in terms of the image and layout, so it's a really nice looking rear cover. We have digital audio, but this being Cinemascope, I would guess this is matrix stereo to recreate the original multi-track magnetic stereo of the Cinemascope engagements. Nice amount of chapter stops, but it's just a single CLV disc, but it does include the trailer at the end rather nicely. So this is just another film I've always heard about, seen clips of and things, and never gotten to see, so it'll make a great double feature with Diane as well. This is an earlier pressing of the classic Love Me or Leave Me. Of course, it's not widescreen, but it's got the spiffier MGM Musicals cover, which is quite nice and part of an overall musical series. This is from 1989, but if you want the film on the best Laserdisc, you should go for the rather common letterbox pressing that I have. But this will be interesting to compare with that because it also has a digital soundtrack, which I'm sure is probably stereo as well. But it's nice to look at some of these variants when you can. But of course, this will be pan and scan, and this is not a film you want to see pan and scanned. But still, I'm just curious to look at the transfer and compare the audio, because sometimes the audio can vary quite substantially, even when it's just a slightly earlier pan and scan version versus the widescreen master, just depending on what they had and what they transferred. But just figured it'd be fun to compare the transfers. Next, I've got the Fox widescreen version of Anastasia, which has the nice cover with the sort of framed photograph design. And this was the film that was sort of Ingrid Bergman's triumphant return to Hollywood in terms of successful feature films. This is in the Fox widescreen style, so it's got the gray back and, of course, some nice liner notes with the chapter stops. There's no extras or trailer here, but we do have a digital stereo soundtrack, so I'm assuming this is matrix encoded with a form of the original multi-channel original audio. And then we have a really lovely gatefold in the Fox style with one of these lovely full-page color panels. Then we have the Doris Day vehicle, the Pajama Game, with the lovely original poster artwork on this very striking jacket with the pink background. So this is a really nice display jacket in terms of LD artwork. Otherwise, it's a standard Warner jacket. Of course, it's going to be a 133 transfer, and there's no indication about the audio. It'll be nice to check against the DVD and look at the transfer and the audio. Otherwise, it's just a standard earlier Warner disc, but it's got the really fantastic cover, which also still has some gloss on it. So I just love the cover of this. Then we have the Warner disc for Auntie Mame. This is actually widescreen, even though there's no indication. We have the original poster artwork nicely done, but it's 2 discs with no gatefold. So this jacket nicely doesn't have a lot of damage or messed up corners and still has the spines intact, but do keep in mind this is not a gatefold as Warner would commonly do. The rear is the typical Warner style, but it does actually tell you that it's widescreen nicely, which is good for a change because they frequently didn't do that. No indication about the sound, but I believe this has digital mono as well as it being a widescreen disc. But again, I'm not 100% sure on that. I always have to double check the Laserdisc database when I'm uploading or looking at discs because Warner liked to not tell you important transfer facts. But still, this is the version on Laserdisc you'll want to get because it's actually widescreen. Next is the standard Fox disc for The Hustler in terms of the standard widescreen edition. Beautiful jacket. This, I think, is one of the best looking of the Fox widescreen edition jackets in the original style with the big gray top. Of course, this being an iconic black and white film, having the black and white still looks fantastic on the jacket. The rear is in the traditional Fox style with a great amount of liner notes. We have digital mono, which is the original mix of the film, and now I can finally compare this to other versions like the Blu-ray, which I've always wanted to do. This is just a disc that's eluded me in good shape for the standard widescreen version. Like a lot of the earlier Fox widescreen discs, we have a great gatefold, great images, but then on one side, there is, of course, a lot of dead space in spite of the text write-ups. But that's what you usually see on a lot of these Fox discs at this time. We have another of these earlier RCA Columbia discs for a Columbia film. Of course, it's going to be pan and scan. But this is a really nice jacket of Mysterious Island with the original poster artwork. Nicely done. You have the red banner. You have all the logos that indicate this is an early RCA Columbia disc. And of course, this is one of the iconic Ray Harryhausen films, which is its biggest claim to fame. And really interestingly, if you look here, this is from David Strohmeyer's collection. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the same David Strohmeyer who's involved in a lot of the Cinerama reconstructions and restorations. So every once in a while you find a disc with somebody's original collection sticker. It's usually, just random people's names, but people do occasionally find, famous people's Laserdiscs, or they bought one of John Carpenter's old Laserdiscs that he auctioned off or something like that. But it's definitely a first for me to find a disc with a collection sticker and it's somebody's name who I recognize. So I definitely did a double take when I saw that the first time. The rear is the same traditional sort of style, have the black banner on the top, a nice light gloss finish, and the overall jacket has held up pretty well, so it's in better shape than most of the old Columbia discs that I've seen. But of course, this is not really how you want to see the film. I would suggest going with the really great Indicator Blu-ray, which I have, but it'll be fascinating to look at this old transfer and also see what the audio track is like. And then last but not least is a fascinating 1991 Western, which is Son of the Morning Star. This is actually, I believe it's a television film about General Custer leading up to the Battle of Bighorn, and it is 216 minutes long. So I believe it was originally done as like a television miniseries coming after things like Lonesome Dove and around the time of Dances with Wolves as well, theatrically. So this was when the Western or cavalry films could actually be, at least profitable and were in vogue at the time. So I know I've seen maybe a clip of this, or I've definitely read about it, but I've just never gotten to see it. This is a nice looking release. Of course, it's 2 discs, obviously. This was done by Republic Home Video, and nicely we have really great wraparound cover artwork. So you get that effect on the outside of the jacket, which isn't something you often see on Laserdisc, which is really neat. The gatefold inside is also fantastic. We have some lovely information about the film, and this does actually include a rather substantial making of documentary at the end, which is supposed to be about 30 minutes or so. So that's tacked on to the rather long television miniseries. So this is a really nice looking LD that I'm very excited to actually check out, and very happy that it was here in this box. So that takes care of this big box of Spencer Old Man discs of classic titles that came from the wonderful Maxeene, the Laserdisc Queen, and the wonderful web store she runs over at Hollywood Laserdisc. So if you haven't checked out Hollywood Laserdisc, definitely do so. She has fantastic finds, deals, and sales all the time, and it really is your best source for Laserdisc outside of Laserdisc database on the entire internet. So I strongly encourage all Laserdisc fans to go check out Maxene's site. There'll be a link in the description below. But as always, I hope my babbles about classic films and Laserdisc releases and home video histories has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Hopefully you were able to find something in this video that you yourself might want to add to your wish list or pick up on LD, or maybe dust off a title you haven't watched in a long time that you have in your own collection. As always, please keep supporting your local independent stores to help keep them in business by hopefully being able to find some nice Laserdiscs in your area, but also definitely check out sellers on the Laserdisc database and also Maxeene over at Hollywood Laserdisc and help support fellow Laserdisc fans. And as always, keep your disc spinning, keep your players going to help keep both the Laserdisc format and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.